Michael adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag as he joined the line at the boarding gate. He hadn't seen his family in 2 years, not since he'd moved to Chicago for work. This Christmas was supposed to be different. He promised his mom he'd be there, and she'd sounded so happy on the phone. As the airline attendant scanned his ticket, Michael glanced out the window. The plane was there, its massive wings shining under the floodlights. Snow flurries swirled around it, softening the edges of the cold December night. "Have a safe flight, Mr. Hayes," the attendant said with a polite smile. Michael nodded, stepping into the jet bridge. Some of the engines grew louder as he walked. Inside the plane, everything looked normal: rows of seats, overhead bins, and passengers settling in. He found his seat by the window and tucked his bag under the seat in front of him. His neighbor hadn't arrived yet, but the flight was almost full. The captain's voice came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 218 to New York. Our flight time tonight will be approximately 2 hours and 30 minutes. Sit back, relax, and we'll be underway shortly." Michael sighed, feeling a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. He hated flying, but he couldn't wait to see his little sister's face when he walked through the door with the gifts he'd spent hours picking out. As the plane began taxiing, he noticed a woman sitting across the aisle. She was staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't blink, didn't move. Michael turned away, chalking it up to pre-flight nerves. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky, leaving the lights of Chicago behind. It wasn't until they were well above the clouds that Michael realized something was off. The cabin lights flickered, and his neighbor never arrived. The seat beside him remained eerily empty, though he distinctly remembered seeing the same seat number on another passenger's boarding pass. Then, a low voice crackled through the intercom. It wasn't the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Tonight, this flight is heading somewhere unexpected." Michael frowned, looking around. The other passengers seemed confused, too. A man a few rows ahead unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, glancing toward the flight attendants for answers. "Excuse me," the man called out, his voice loud and firm. "What's going on? That wasn't the captain." The flight attendants, standing near the galley, exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, a tall man with a name tag reading Josh, stepped forward, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," Josh said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "We're experiencing a minor technical issue with the intercom system. The captain is aware, and there's no cause for concern." Michael didn't buy it. The voice on the intercom had sounded deliberate, almost mocking. And now, something else was bothering him. He pulled out his phone, hoping to check the in-flight tracker. Maybe seeing their position would reassure him. But his phone, which had been fully charged before takeoff, was dead. He glanced at the screen in front of him. It, too, was unresponsive. "Excuse me," Michael said, flagging down Josh as he passed. "What's wrong with the in-flight entertainment? And my phone just died out of nowhere." Josh hesitated, then smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "There might be an issue with the power supply. We'll address it shortly. Please sit tight." Michael nodded, but his unease grew. He looked around the cabin again. The woman across the aisle was still frozen in the same position, staring straight ahead. Another passenger, an older man 2 rows up, was looking out the window, his expression tense. Michael leaned toward the window himself and peered outside. They should have been over the dark expanse of the Midwest by now, but he didn't see any lights below. No cities, no roads, nothing. Just a vast, empty blackness. He felt his pulse quicken. "Excuse me," the older man said to Josh as he passed. "Where exactly are we flying? Shouldn't we see something down there? It's not cloud cover." Josh opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the intercom crackled again. "Passengers, please remain calm," the same low, unfamiliar voice said. "We'll be reaching our destination shortly. This is all part of the journey." A chill ran down Michael's spine. Around him, murmurs of fear spread through the cabin. The older man stood abruptly. "I want to speak to the captain," he demanded, starting toward the front of the plane. "Sir, please return to your seat." Josh's voice was louder now, more forceful. But the man didn't stop. He reached the cockpit door, only to find it locked. He pounded on it. "Open this door." Then, the lights in the cabin went out entirely. The plane was plunged into darkness, broken only by the dim, eerie glow of emergency lighting. Michael gripped his armrests as a wave of panic spread through the passengers. Somewhere toward the back of the plane, someone screamed. The intercom crackled once more. "This flight is now under my control," the voice said, colder this time. "Sit down, be quiet, and prepare for arrival." Michael's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was speaking? Where was the plane going? And most importantly, why? Michael's breath quickened as chaos erupted around him. Passengers shouted at the flight attendants, demanding answers, while others frantically tried their dead phones, shaking them as if that could restore the power. Michael turned toward the older man, who was still pounding on the cockpit door. "They have to respond," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Sir, please sit down," Josh yelled, his voice cracking slightly. The calm demeanor was gone, replaced with fear barely concealed behind his professional mask. Michael decided he couldn't just sit back. He unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward the man at the cockpit door. "Hey," he called out, "let's think this through. The man turned, his face pale. What is there to think about? Someone's hijacked this plane. Maybe, Michael replied, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic in his chest. But if we act rashly, we might make things worse. Let's try to figure out what's going on first. Josh, seeing Michael trying to mediate, stepped closer. Sir, please take your seats. The captain is working on the situation. You don't know anything, a woman shouted from her seat. We're just supposed to trust you when someone hijacked the intercom? Another attendant, a young woman with trembling hands, tried to soothe her, but the woman wouldn't have it. Tell us the truth. Where are we going? The murmurs grew louder, and the tension in the cabin became unbearable. Michael needed answers, fast. Okay, he said, turning to Josh. If we can't talk to the captain, can we at least get into the galley? Check if there's a phone or radio that works. Josh hesitated. The cockpit is secure, he said, avoiding eye contact. That's protocol. We can't access communications from the cabin. Michael stared at him. You mean we're cut off? Completely. Before Josh could answer, the plane jolted violently, throwing passengers against their seats. Screams filled the cabin as overhead bins popped open, spilling bags into the aisles. Michael grabbed the armrest of a nearby seat, steadying himself. The plane leveled out again, but now the murmurs had turned into outright panic. A chilling realization hit him. The voice on the intercom had said they were approaching their destination. But Michael knew their flight path and they weren't supposed to descend for another hour. He glanced out the window again. This time, he noticed faint shapes in the darkness below. Mountains. What the hell? Michael whispered. They were nowhere near New York. Suddenly, the intercom came to life once more. We will be landing shortly, the voice announced, calm but final. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Your compliance is necessary. Michael turned to Josh, his voice low but firm. Tell me the truth. What's going on? Josh's face crumpled. I don't know, he whispered, his voice barely audible. We lost contact with ground control 10 minutes after takeoff. The captain locked the door and hasn't said a word since. We're flying blind. Michael's stomach dropped. And the intercom? Josh shook his head. That wasn't the captain. The plane began its descent, tilting forward as the engine slowed. Passengers clutched their seats, some praying, others crying. Michael knew he had to act. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal, and waiting for answers wouldn't save them. He glanced around, looking for anything that could help. His eyes landed on the emergency exit near the wing. If he couldn't get to the cockpit, maybe there was another way to figure out where they were. Michael's eyes darted toward the emergency exit, but the rational part of his brain screamed at him to stay put. Opening a door mid-flight was suicide. He took a deep breath. trying to clear his thoughts. He had to focus on something actionable. The plane continued its descent, and Michael noticed the mountains below becoming clearer, their peaks jagged and dusted with snow. The landscape was barren, no lights, no roads, no signs of civilization. Josh, the flight attendant, grabbed the intercom handset, speaking quickly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. Remain calm. We are experiencing..." The voice cut him off, booming over the speakers. "Silence. Everyone, stay in your seats. We are almost there." Josh froze, his knuckles white as he gripped the handset. Michael leaned closer to him, lowering his voice. "Josh, you said the captain hasn't responded. Are you sure he's still in the cockpit?" Josh hesitated, then nodded, but his expression betrayed doubt. Michael pressed further. "What if something happened to him? We need to check." Josh swallowed hard but didn't answer. Instead, he turned and hurried toward the galley. Michael followed him, ignoring the passengers' panicked murmurs. When they reached the galley, Josh opened a storage compartment and pulled out the cabin crew's emergency access key. "This is against protocol," Josh muttered, his hands shaking. Michael nodded. "I know, but you don't have a choice." Together, they approached the cockpit door. Josh inserted the key into the access panel and twisted. The door clicked open slightly, and Michael pushed it the rest of the way. The cockpit was dark. Michael's heart raced as he stepped inside. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The controls were lit up, and the autopilot was engaged. But the captain and co-pilot, they were slumped in their seats, motionless. "Are they?" Josh whispered, peering over Michael's shoulder. Michael leaned closer and felt for a pulse on the captain's neck. It was there, faint, but steady. The co-pilot was the same, alive but unresponsive. "They're unconscious," Michael said, his voice tight. "But why? What could?" The intercom crackled again, and the voice returned. "You shouldn't have done that." Michael spun around, looking for the source. The voice was coming directly from the cockpit speakers. "What do you want?" Michael shouted. The voice laughed, cold and mechanical. "You're almost there, Michael. Your family is waiting." Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone on this flight about his family. Suddenly, the autopilot disengaged, and the controls moved on their own. The plane tilted sharply, aligning perfectly with a flat, snow-covered plateau ahead. Michael grabbed the yoke, trying to pull it back, but it wouldn't budge. "Josh, help me," he yelled. Josh hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the controls alongside Michael. Together, they strained against the plane's movements, but it was no use. The plane was completely under external control. The voice spoke one last time, calm and final. "It's time to go home." The plane touched down smoothly on the snow-covered plateau, skidding to a stop. Outside, Michael could see shadowy figures approaching the aircraft. They weren't wearing uniforms or rescue gear, just dark silhouettes moving with purpose. The cabin door unlocked with a loud click, and the shadowy figures stepped inside. "Michael Hayes," one of them said in a deep, authoritative voice. "You're coming with us." Claire adjusted her seatbelt, settling into her window seat for the overnight flight from Denver to Seattle. The plane hummed quietly as passengers stowed their bags and found their seats. She glanced at her phone one last time, reading her brother's text. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Drive safe from the airport." Claire smiled, though her nerves prickled. Flying always made her uneasy, especially at night. She stuffed her phone into the seat pocket and stared out the window, the lights of the runway blurring in the winter drizzle. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration as the engines roared to life. The plane began to taxi, and soon they were airborne, climbing into the night sky. Once they leveled off, Claire tried to distract herself by scrolling through the in-flight entertainment options. She chose a romantic comedy and adjusted her headphones, hoping the film would drown out her unease. About an hour into the flight, turbulence began, a gentle rocking at first, nothing unusual. But as minutes passed, it grew worse. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. This should pass shortly." Claire glanced around. Most passengers looked calm, though a few clutched their armrests or stared out the windows. But then, something strange happened. The turbulence stopped suddenly, too suddenly. One moment the plane was shaking violently, and the next, it was eerily still. The cabin lights flickered, dimming briefly before returning to full brightness. A few people murmured uneasily, but no one seemed alarmed. Claire felt a chill, though she couldn't explain why. Moments later, a loud bang echoed from beneath the plane. Gasps filled the cabin, and the flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. "What was that?" the man in the seat next to Claire asked, half to her and half to himself. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. The captain's voice returned, but this time it sounded strained. Folks. We're dealing with a minor mechanical issue. Nothing to worry about. We'll update you shortly." Claire's unease deepened. The turbulence might have been routine, but that bang wasn't. And now, the plane seemed to be descending too soon for their destination. Looking out the window, she expected to see the faint glow of city lights below. Instead, there was nothing, just pitch-black darkness, as though the plane were flying over an endless void. The man next to her leaned closer. "Do you feel like we're going down?" Claire nodded, her throat tight. A commotion broke out near the back of the plane. Someone was shouting, and a flight attendant hurried down the aisle. Claire craned her neck to see but couldn't make out what was happening. Then, the lights flickered again, and the cabin went completely dark. Panic erupted. Passengers screamed, and Claire's heart pounded in her chest. The emergency lights came on, casting an eerie red glow. "Everyone remain calm," a flight attendant shouted. "Please stay seated." Her voice cut off abruptly, drowned out by a deep, rumbling noise that seemed to come from all around them. The plane shook violently, but this time, it wasn't turbulence. It felt like something was gripping the aircraft. Claire's breath hitched as she looked out the window. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then she saw it clearly. Massive, shadowy shapes moving just beyond the wing, their outlines faint but unmistakably real. The intercom crackled. This time, the voice wasn't the captain's. It was deep and distorted, as though coming from somewhere far away. "You were never meant to leave." The voice sent a chill down Claire's spine, its haunting echo lingering in the cabin. Passengers froze, the earlier panic giving way to a terrified silence. The plane jolted again, and Claire clutched her armrests, her heart racing. "What was that?" someone near the front shouted, breaking the silence. The flight attendants exchanged frantic looks. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor that seemed forced, grabbed the intercom handset. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "please stay seated and remain calm. We're investigating." The plane dipped sharply, cutting him off. Screams erupted as overhead bins flew open, and bags tumbled into the aisles. Claire's stomach lurched, and she gripped her seatbelt tighter. Looking out the window again, she saw the shadows moving alongside the plane, closer now. They were enormous, amorphous shapes, flickering in and out of visibility like smoke caught in a beam of light. The man seated next to her was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. "This can't be real," he muttered. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "What is that?" The plane leveled out suddenly, the eerie calm returning. The emergency lights continued to bathe the cabin in red, casting long, distorted shadows. Then, the distorted voice returned, clearer this time. "You were warned, but you did not listen." Claire's breath caught. Warned. What were they talking about? A passenger near the back of the plane stood up, shouting. "What's going on? Who's doing this?" The shadows outside seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, Claire thought she saw a face, a pale, inhuman face pressing against the window of the rear door. She blinked, and it was gone. The flight attendant who had spoken earlier stumbled into the aisle, visibly shaken. "Everyone needs to sit down and stay calm. We're trying to..." Another loud bang echoed from beneath the plane, and the cabin shook violently. This time, the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Claire grabbed hers, her fingers fumbling as she tried to secure it over her face. The distorted voice spoke again, louder, filling the cabin. You were told not to fly this path. The skies are not yours. Claire felt a surge of confusion and fear. What did that mean? She glanced at her seatmate, who was now muttering prayers under his breath. The captain's voice finally returned, strained and breathless. This is your captain speaking. We're attempting an emergency landing. Brace for impact. Passengers screamed as the plane began a rapid descent. Claire clutched her armrests, her mind racing. She thought of her brother waiting for her in Seattle, of all the plans they'd made. Would she ever see him again? The shadows outside the plane closed in, surrounding the aircraft entirely. The cabin grew darker, the emergency lights flickering. Claire's ears popped painfully as the plane plunged lower. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the turbulence stopped. The plane leveled out, gliding smoothly. Claire looked out the window. Below them, she saw lights, a small airport runway surrounded by dense forest. Relief washed over her. They were landing. Somehow they were landing. The plane touched down roughly but remained intact, skidding to a halt. The cabin erupted in cheers and sobs of relief. But Claire's relief was short-lived. Outside, the runway lights flickered unnaturally, and the airport terminal looked abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. The intercom crackled one final time. You are here. But this is not where you belong. The cabin door unlocked with a loud hiss, and Claire's heart sank as she saw the shadows begin to seep inside. The cabin filled with uneasy murmurs as the shadows seemed to writhe in the doorway, an unnatural, shifting darkness that didn't obey the laws of light or movement. Claire pressed herself back into her seat, her pulse hammering in her ears. Stay seated, a flight attendant shouted, his voice trembling. Please stay calm. But the warning went unheeded. Several passengers bolted for the exits, desperate to escape the oppressive tension. As they approached the cabin door, the shadows surged forward like a wave, enveloping the first man to reach it. He screamed, a blood-curdling sound, and then silence. He was gone. The remaining passengers froze, staring at the empty doorway where the man had stood moments before. One woman began sobbing uncontrollably, and another whispered prayers under her breath. Claire's seatmate, his face pale and sweat-drenched, leaned toward her. This isn't happening. It's not real, he muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Claire tore her eyes away from the door and looked out the window. The runway was still there, but the lights were dimming, flickering in irregular patterns. Beyond the tarmac, the surrounding forest loomed, unnaturally still. We need to move, she whispered, gripping the armrest. We can't stay here. Her seatmate shook his head. Where would we go? Did you see what happened to him? The shadows in the doorway pulsed again, receding slightly as if waiting. Then, the captain's voice came over the intercom, hoarse and strained. Passengers, please remain calm. Stay on the plane. Do not exit under any circumstances. Claire frowned. The captain's tone was off mechanical, as though he was being forced to speak. She glanced toward the cockpit, but the door remained shut, the small window dark. We can't trust that voice, she said quietly. Josh, the flight attendant who had earlier maintained an air of composure, now stood near the galley, his hands trembling. His eyes met Claire's, and she saw desperation in them. There's an emergency hatch at the back, he whispered, barely audible over the murmurs of the passengers. If we can get it open, we might be able to. He trailed off, glancing at the shadows. Might be able to what? Claire pressed. Get out. Away from whatever that is. He gestured subtly toward the door. Claire nodded. Staying on the plane felt like waiting for doom. Whatever lay outside, they couldn't remain trapped here. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, motioning for her seatmate to follow. Reluctantly, he rose, and a few other passengers nearby did the same, their faces pale but resolute. Josh led the group toward the rear of the plane, his movements quick and deliberate. Claire's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadows near the front door remained still, as if watching but not intervening. When they reached the back, Josh began working on the hatch, his fingers fumbling with the manual override lever. Come on, he muttered. The plane jolted suddenly, a low rumble resonating from below. A passenger yelped, and Claire felt her knees buckle, but she grabbed a seat back for support. What was that? Someone hissed. Josh finally wrenched the lever down, and the hatch popped open with a hiss of compressed air. Bitter cold rushed into the cabin, and Claire shivered as she peered out. The ground was closer than she expected, maybe a 15-foot drop onto the frost-covered tarmac. The shadows didn't seem to be following them, but the eerie silence outside was just as unnerving. Josh looked at Claire. You first. She hesitated, then climbed through the hatch and lowered herself as far as she could before dropping to the ground. The cold bit into her skin as she landed, but she was unhurt. One by one, the others followed, forming a small, huddled group. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was their only option. Run, Josh said. They bolted toward the trees, the crunch of their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Claire didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting as much distance as possible between them and the plane. As they reached the edge of the forest, the rumble from the plane grew louder. Claire glanced over her shoulder and froze. The shadows were spilling out of the open doors, pouring onto the tarmac like liquid smoke. They moved with purpose, spreading rapidly in all directions. Keep moving, Josh shouted, pulling her forward. The group plunged into the trees, the dense branches swallowing them whole. The further they ran, the quieter it became, until all that remained was the sound of their ragged breathing. Eventually, they stopped, collapsing against tree trunks and gasping for air. "What now?" someone asked, their voice trembling. Josh looked around, his expression grim. "We keep going. There has to be a road or a town nearby." Claire nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. Whatever they'd escaped from, it felt far from over. The group pressed deeper into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. Claire's lungs burned, and her muscles ached, but fear drove her forward. The trees loomed high above, their branches tangled into a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "We need to stop," Josh said finally, his voice low. "Catch our breath and figure out where we're going." They gathered in a small clearing, huddling close together. Claire pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen displayed the same mocking message it had for the last hour. No service. "Anyone else have signal?" she asked, her voice shaky. The others checked their devices, but all shook their heads. Josh glanced around, his eyes scanning the dark forest. "We'll rest for a few minutes, but we can't stay here long. If we don't find help soon, hypothermia could be a real problem." The man who had been sitting next to Claire on the plane mic, she'd learned, rubbed his arms, his breath visible in the frigid air. What if, whatever that thing was, is still following us? The group fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. "We'll keep moving," Josh said firmly. "Whatever it is, it hasn't caught up to us yet. That's a good sign." After a brief rest, they continued through the forest. Claire's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What had happened to the plane? What were those shadows? And why had they been targeted? Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The forest seemed endless, each step dragging them deeper into an unfamiliar wilderness. Just as Claire began to lose hope, the faint sound of rushing water reached her ears. "Do you hear that?" she asked, stopping in her tracks. Josh nodded. "A river. If we follow it, it might lead us to civilization." The group turned toward the sound, their pace quickening. Soon, they reached the edge of a wide, fast-moving river. The water was icy, but the sight of it buoyed their spirits. "We'll follow the bank," Josh said. "Stay close." They trudged along the riverbank, the current a constant companion. After another hour, the first glimmers of dawn appeared on the horizon. The forest began to thin, and with it came a flicker of hope. Then, they saw it, a wooden bridge spanning the river, and beyond it, the faint outline of a road. Claire's heart leapt. "We made it!" The group crossed the bridge, their relief palpable. On the other side, they found an empty two-lane road stretching into the distance. We'll flag down the first car that comes by, Josh said. If we stick together, we'll be okay. Minutes turned into an hour, and no cars appeared. But as the sun rose higher, the road became warmer, less menacing. The horrors of the night began to feel distant, almost surreal. Finally, a truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the early morning haze. The group waved frantically, and the truck slowed to a stop. The driver, a grizzled older man, rolled down his window. "What the hell are you folks doing out here?" Josh stepped forward. "We were on a flight. It crashed, or something happened. We need help." The man frowned. "A plane crash? Haven't heard anything about that on the news." "It just happened," Claire insisted. "Please, can you take us to the nearest town?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "Get in." The group climbed into the truck bed, huddling together as the vehicle rumbled down the road. When they reached the nearest town, Claire and the others told their story to the local authorities. But as they spoke, strange inconsistencies began to emerge. No flight matching their description had been scheduled. No crash had been reported. The airline had no record of the flight, and none of the passengers appeared on any manifest. Weeks later, Claire sat in her brother's living room, staring at the news. Investigators had found the plane, abandoned in the forest with no signs of the crew or passengers. The shadows they had escaped from were never explained. Some mysteries, Claire realized, weren't meant to be solved.